Chapter 16 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Ann. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 16. New Orleans. The way was now clear to New Orleans, and as soon as General Butler could get his transports from the Gulf side round into the river again, he proceeded, after occupying the forts, as rapidly as possible up the river with his troops. On the 1st of May the naval forces under Farragut turned over to him the formal possession of the city, and he continued in command of the Department of the Gulf until the following December. The withdrawal of General Lovell and the abandonment of Forts Pike and Macomb at the entrances of Lake Pontchartrain left him with no serious campaign immediately on his hands, but the task of governing the city of New Orleans was one which put all his energy and shrewdness into requisition. The supply of provisions had been interrupted by the military operations of the rebels themselves before the coming of Farragut's fleet. A portion of these again were carried away with Lovell's retiring army. When Butler came, starvation was close upon 150,000 people of New Orleans. To avert this danger was the general's first urgent effort, and he made it successful over all difficulties. His second care was to quell and to control the dangerous disloyalty of the population. An order to his own soldiers forbade, under the severest penalties, the stealing of public or private property. A proclamation to the citizens established martial law and made minute regulations for the preservation of order. He gave to neutral aliens and to loyalists assurance of full protection to persons and property, and to non-combatant Confederates also, so far as the exigencies of the public service would permit. In their most favorable phases, war and martial law are full of necessary sacrifice and harshness, and it may be said that General Butler's military government, firm and vigilant throughout, was tolerant and even liberal to the well-disposed and orderly, but severe against transgressors and the malicious plottings of certain individuals, corporations, and classes in aid of rebellion. These pages do not afford room for an extended review of General Butler's administration. In all the war, no man was so severely criticized by his enemies or more warmly defended by his friends. Confederate newspapers, orators, and writers have exhausted the vocabulary of abuse for epithets to heap upon his name, from Yankee to beast and butcher. Secession sympathizers in England approvingly echoed this defamation. Palmerston in the House of Commons went out of his way to swell the unthinking British clamor by repeating the unjust censure. The whole subject might profitably be buried as part of the animosities and passions of the war, were it not that Jefferson Davis sought to turn the circumstance to the advantage of the rebellion by a sensational official proclamation declaring Butler an outlaw and common enemy of mankind, to be immediately executed by hanging in case of capture, also adding that all commissioned officers in the command of said Benjamin F. Butler be declared not entitled to be considered as soldiers engaged in honorable warfare, but as robbers and criminals deserving death, and that they and each of them be, wherever captured, reserved for execution. Since the rebel chief thus prominently inscribed Butler and his officers on the historical record, the recitals of his proclamation deserve a passing notice. In the list of reasons assigned to support his declaration of outlawry, the allegations of imprisonment or expulsion from the city may at once be dismissed as the ordinary incidents of war, which the Confederates themselves were daily practicing in different parts of the country. So also of the complaint of military fines and assessments. Manifestly, they are a harsh and arbitrary mode of reprisal for treason and hostility, but international law recognizes them, and all civilized nations practice them. The charge that Butler armed African slaves for a servile war first disappears technically under Butler's showing that he armed no slaves, but only free citizens of color, many of whom the rebels themselves had enlisted and drilled before his coming, while the whole charge disappears generally under President Lincoln's proclamation and policy of emancipation, begun before Davis's edict of outlawry was issued. There remain therefore but two further points to be examined: the execution of Mumford and the so-called Woman Order. Mumford, it will be remembered, tore down the United States flag, which by Farragut's order was raised over the Mint on the morning of April 27th. He remained in the city, openly boasted of his crime, and courted applause for his recklessness. When Butler came, he had him arrested and tried by a military commission which, on June 5, convicted him of treason and an overt act thereof, and Butler ordered the sentence to be executed on June 7th, on which day Mumford was hanged. Jefferson Davis's proclamation calls this deliberate murder, when said Mumford was an unresisting and non-combatant captive, and for no offense even alleged to have been committed by him subsequent to the date of the capture of the said city. Such a recital is the merest quibbling. The rebel president well knew that the flag torn down by Mumford had been raised by Farragut after the demand of unqualified surrender on April 26th. After the reply by the mayor on the same day that the city was evacuated by Confederate troops, its administration restored back to him that it was without means of defense and promising a religious compliance of the people to yield obedience to the conqueror. Mumford's crime was against the sovereignty of the United States, duly claimed and enforced by the commissioned officer and the naval power of the government, to which the municipal authority had formally submitted. The offender thus violated not only military law, but also the sanctity of the mayor's promise. To declare that Mumford was executed for pulling down the flag at New Orleans before its occupation by the United States forces is willfully to ignore history, law, and evidence. There is no flaw in the chain of legal and technical justice. But if on merely humane considerations we question the severity of the punishment, Jefferson Davis's extravagant fulmination is rebuked by the acts of his own government and his distinct approval of them. 6 months before the hanging of Mumford, the rebel Secretary of War instructed his officer at Knoxville in regard to the traitors in East Tennessee. All such as can be identified as having been engaged in bridge burning are to be tried summarily by drumhead court-martial, and if found guilty, executed on the spot by hanging. It would be well to leave their bodies hanging in the vicinity of the burned bridges. The consideration of the woman order requires a preliminary word. Nobody at the North could properly find fault with the women of the South for reflecting the political bias of Southern communities, or because the natural instincts of their sex led them to sympathize with and warmly espouse the secession and rebellion in which their fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons embarked. It was to be expected that their prayers would go with them to the battlefield, and their labors, charities, and sacrifices forward them cheer and comfort to camp and hospital. But the records and traditions of the war make it painfully evident that in every rebel state the expression of hatred for Yankees was intentionally practiced and cultivated among portions of the female population of towns and cities, and in this members of the upper classes were frequently the most conspicuous transgressors. Not content with merely entertaining feelings hostile to Union officers and soldiers, they indulged in obtrusive manifestations of them, relying on the respect and privileges accorded their sex for immunity from retort or retaliation. They turned their backs to avoid looking at them. They stepped from sidewalks into the streets to avoid meeting them. They held aside their skirts to indicate a dread of contamination. They turned up their noses as if they smelled foul odors. They feigned nausea as if their presence were insupportable. They retired from streetcars or church pews when they entered. They flaunted miniature secession flags and sang secession songs in their presence, or thumped secession melodies when they passed their open windows. They uttered uncomplimentary remarks in their hearing, and in some extreme cases deliberately spat on the Federal uniform. Behavior of this nature was not isolated and local, but prevailed widely throughout the South in multiplied forms during the war. Probably only a minority of the women of the South indulged in these antics, but it was a minority so considerable and so diffused that such exhibitions uniformly attended the presence and progress of Federal armies in rebel communities. As a rule, such behavior was only a rankling annoyance which soldiers and officers endured in silence. But in New Orleans, where a mere handful of troops had to govern a great population and prevent violence, it became a serious danger to discipline and authority. Such open and hourly disrespect was a constant incitement to disorder and mobs. "We were 2,500 men," wrote Butler, "in a city 7 miles long by 2 to 4 wide, of 150,000 inhabitants, all hostile, bitter, defiant, explosive, standing literally on a magazine and a spark only needed for destruction." But how to abate the evil? The ordinary punishments of arrest, fine, and imprisonment were inapplicable. The offences were too vague, the cases too numerous. He could not bring even a fraction of these female malignants into a police court. The only remedy was to stamp their public rudeness with the seal of public disgrace. In his own language, no order could be made save one which would execute itself. He remembered an old ordinance of the city of London, which he had read in some law book, and, copying its phraseology, he, on May 15th, published his Order No. 28, which announced that, as the officers and soldiers of the United States had been subject to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter when any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. General Butler's simple and plain intention was to abate a nuisance in public demeanor which could be reached in no other way, and he so explained it to the mayor on the following day. "There has been," he wrote, "no room for the misunderstanding of General Order No. 28. No lady will take any notice of a strange gentleman, and a fortiori of a stranger, in such form as to attract attention. If obeyed, it will protect the true and modest woman from all possible insult." We have publicized testimony of a member of General Butler's staff as to the result. "Can I say anything stronger," he wrote, "in vindication of the propriety of this order, or of the general's sagacity in issuing it, than that the first 24 hours after its promulgation witnessed a complete, and, it seemed to us who were there almost miraculous, change in the deportment of the ladies of the Crescent City? If success is the test of merit, then was it one of the most meritorious acts of the war." One tremendous outcry, however, of denunciation and misconstruction of its language and intent arose from every rebel in the South and every rebel sympathizer in Europe. British blockade runners were just beginning to reap their enormous profits from contraband trade with the rebellion, and Lord Palmerston, Prime Minister of England, grew eloquent, and the London Times and Punch indignant, over the infamous doings of the Yankee Haynau and Nana Sahib. General Butler's nature is combative, and he had a ready retort to such high criticism, which in due time he embodied in his farewell address. With a single additional comment the woman order may be dismissed from consideration. In his proclamation of outlawry against Butler, Jefferson Davis says of it, "The soldiers of the United States have been invited and encouraged by general orders to insult and outrage the wives, mothers, and the sisters of our citizens. Unconsciously, the rebel president's language proved more than he intended. Like the testimony of many another prejudiced witness, his accusation answered itself. He wrote this assertion more than 6 full months after Butler's order was issued, and during the whole of which period it had remained in force. In the same proclamation David recited, in as pathetic and harrowing language as he could command, the wrongs and sufferings which he alleged Butler's administration had heaped upon the people of New Orleans. Fine, imprisonment, exile, chains, labor, confiscation, starvation, murder, but not one single instance of insult, much less outrage, under the woman order is mentioned in the long, sensational catalogue. The simple truth is, Order No. 28 sprang from no evil design of the commander, and was neither misunderstood by, nor provoked the least evil act from his officers or soldiers. But for the prominence given it by the Confederates to "fire the Southern heart" and stimulate the intervention of France and England, it would have merited no discussion except as a question of taste. In that respect it can no more be defended than can the unseemly parade of it as a Southern grievance. At the same time, its salutary influence in checking the public misbehavior at which it was aimed will scarcely be denied. However loud was the outcry against Butler's methods, there is a cheerful and universal admission of his energy and efficiency. Never in its long history was New Orleans so quiet, orderly, clean, and healthy. Though he rigorously exacted obedience to his police orders and abstinence from public and private hostility to the flag and laws of the government, he repaid the people 1,000-fold by keeping the wolf of starvation from their doors and the dreadful scourge of yellow fever out of their homes. The city was without provisions and without occupation, with trade stagnant, with supplies cut off, with industry paralyzed, with a worthless currency, with credit destroyed, with confidence gone, with poverty widespread and irremediable, with demoralization in every part of the social structure. These combined evils he grappled with intelligent resolution and the confidence born of an indomitable will. He distributed among the poor the captured Confederate rations. He allowed provisions already purchased by the city to be freely brought from Mobile and Red River. He organized relief associations. Finding certain lists of wealthy citizens who had subscribed $1.25 million to the rebel war fund, he assessed them 1/4 of their subscription and applied it to feeding the poor. This relief fund was augmented by contributions levied on another list of merchants who had published a newspaper card advertising planters not to send their produce to New Orleans. But he also made this relief fund serve a wider purpose than mere charity. He used it to employ from 1,000 to 2,000 laborers every day in cleaning the streets and building up the levees and putting the city to rights generally. All the drainage of the city is done by means of canals, and we cleaned out between 10 and 11 miles of canal, some of which had not been cleaned for 12 or 15 years. The consequence was that we had comparatively no sickness in the city of New Orleans. I had a regiment 1,000 strong in the city during the months of July and August, and it buried but one man. This was an essential step, maintaining public health, but he did not neglect the other. I established a very strict quarantine, continues his testimony. I would not allow any vessel that came from an infected port to come up to the city under 30 days. If she had anything like a perishable cargo, it was taken out and thoroughly overhauled and fumigated. I did allow a small steamer from New York to come up, the captain stating that he touched Nassau merely to take in coal, and was there but a short time. It turned out, however, that he did take passengers on board, one of whom had the yellow fever after he arrived at New Orleans. I immediately had the square shut up completely, allowed no one to enter or leave it, whitewashed everything, cleaned the square up, fumigated it, and when the man died, buried him and pretty much everything he had ever looked at. This ended the matter. We did not have another case of yellow fever in New Orleans. That, however, demonstrated the fact that yellow fever is not indigenous there, but requires to be imported, and that it may be quarantined even after it has been brought into the river. It perhaps can be fully done only by military measures, but it was effectually done there, although they had it everywhere on the coast, in Matamoras, Galveston, Sabine Pass, and at Pensacola, and I had 5 or 6 cases down at quarantine. It must not be inferred that the rebels threw no obstacles in Butler's way. The persistent effort of the mayor to recant his surrender of the city has been noted, and following out this policy, which was prompted from Richmond, secret machinations by prominent Confederates perplexed the commanding general at almost every step of his administration. They abused his permits to bring food by secret mails and contraband supplies. The city authorities neglected efficient cooperation. The rebel governor refused to allow provisions to be brought. Banks and corporations connived with foreign councils to hide rebel funds. It was a running fight between loyal government and all the subterfuges which treason could invent, and Butler used his power of detection and punishment unsparingly upon willful offenders. But a fair balancing of motives and acts would show that in his hands military despotism, instead of bringing oppression and inflicting suffering, compelled the community to submit to peace and protection, to charity and bounty, to health and life. Under the teachings of its leaders and its blind political rage, New Orleans had done its full share to create war. Butler, with autocratic will, forced upon it quiet and order. With suicidal folly, it had created destitution and want and raised the gaunt specter of famine. With imperious authority, Butler filled its hungry mouths and obliged it to reorganize industry and re-establish trade. Through misrule and indolent neglect, it had invited pestilence. Butler relentlessly constrained it to a cleanliness and health it had never experienced. One might almost transpose the Scripture parable to contrast their contumacious opposition and his beneficent compulsion. They asked a scorpion, and he gave them an egg. They asked a serpent, and he gave them a fish. They asked a stone, and he gave them bread. End of chapter 16.